Welcome to the third installment of this series on truth and language. In the first post, I talked briefly about the question as to what truth is and said a bit about the explanatory inversion characterizing the approach here. In the second, a kind of model of a speech community was developed, one where there are just speakers, or speakers as I call them, each of whom values sentences, which again were just sequences of sounds, and gets pleasure from them if they're novel and valuable, where again, pleasure was a sort of contrived pleasure just for the purposes of the model. I distinguished the variances between speakers' valuations with what I somewhat grandly called a value function, and noted importantly that the value of a sentence for a speaker is determined in part by what else she values or believes at the moment of evaluating the sentence. So it's time at last, or most, for the big reveal. Plausibly, for an account of truth to be satisfactory, it must balance two competing requirements. On the one hand, it must provide for the existence of a distinction between what we say to be true and what is true. If the account implies that these collapse into one, that there's no gap between them, then it makes truth trivially easy to state, and so fails accurately to capture the concept we care about. Truth has to be an achievement, at least sometimes. So that's one requirement, but the other is that, on the other hand, that if the account of truth provides no reason to think that what we say is true ever in fact is, so if that gap between what we say and what is the case becomes a gulf, then again, in a different way, it has failed to capture anything we should care about, let alone to hold up as the goal of rational thought. This kind of chasm can open if, for example, our judgments are taken always to be based solely on evidence of what's the case, some kind of evidence, and if this evidence can always fall short of what is the case. So our quest is for what we call the Goldilocks gap, somewhere in between those two extremes. Turning to the model, without the B beliefs parameter to the value function introduced at the end of the last video, the possible thought that what is true is just what a speaker values at the time would have been vulnerable to the first criticism I just mentioned of leaving no gap at all between what's true and what a person says to be true. Introducing that B parameter permits making value conditional and open-ended, reminding ourselves that in the model at least, the only point of language is to get this pleasure. This is what we stipulated again, and that this is achieved by maximizing novel, valuable sentences. The natural thought is a token sentence S is true for speaker A, just in case S is an element of a set which would maximize value for A. Now, before launching into the evaluation and refinement of this, I'll repeat yet again that the definition is in itself just an arbitrary stipulated definition for this contrived little universe. It has to be coherent, of course, but the interest, if it has any, will come later, if it can be convincingly mapped onto the realities of our talk. Anyway, returning to our model, the concept of truth, as defined, is useful to thinking about the objective of maximizing value. The idea is to get as much of it as you can if you're a speaker. A sentence can be valuable with some limited set B of beliefs, but what you want is the biggest set possible to maximize value. What you ultimately care about, if you live in the model, is that this particular sentence is in that biggest set, right? If it can matter, because valuing a sentence which is not in that biggest set, so a false sentence, might because of the role of B in your value function, lead you to reject newly encountered sentences, which if only you had known, really do belong in that biggest set. So if you value a false belief, it's in your B set, then when you go to evaluate new sentences, you might come up with the wrong valuation, might get led astray and sort of get off track, if you like. So again, the whole point of this is that within the model, it makes sense that one should care about truth. Now, as concerns our gap requirement, returning to that for a moment, this definition also provides that truth is related to value, that the gap is not too big. The values of some sentences, so observational sentences, if you recall, are mostly independent of what else a person believes, meaning they're likely true if highly valued. This in turn means that other theory sentences, if highly valued when B contains only valued observation sentences, likely are also, and so on as you get more and more theoretical, with the probability of being true diminishing as the possibility of error creeps in. On the flip side, again, the value of sentences is always contingent on the addition of new sentences to B, which precludes simply identifying what is believed and what is true. So on this flip side, the gap does not collapse altogether. There's room to quibble here, admittedly, and the model perhaps needs some constraints on how changing this B parameter can influence the value of its sentences. But on the face of it, this is looking like some promisingly tepid porridge. The interest of the concept considerably broadens when we turn to the question as to whether truth should be defined, as it is now, so that it's specific to each individual, or it should be common to all speakers. So one truth for all speakers, or one truth for each speaker. Suppose speaker A utters a sentence which she values in the company of speaker B, and as it turns out, he does not. He disvalues it. If truth is specific to the individual, then there are three main possibilities in this scenario. Scenario one, S is true for speaker A and false for speaker B. Scenario two, possibility two, S is true for both speakers, and speaker B is mistaken about what is true in his idiolect, but he's just got it wrong. Or three, S is false for both, and speaker A is mistaken about what is true in her idiolect. She's got it wrong. And yes, of course, there's also a fourth possibility, which is S is false for speaker A and true for speaker B, and both are mistaken about what's true in their respective idiolects. Let's hope that's not the case. Before delving into this, I'll just digress again. This model is meant to illuminate language, obviously, but it, and I think it's relevant here that it can be considered to be of more general interest as a kind of minimal social configuration which engenders both cooperation and competition for a non-zero sum outcome. That's really what's going on here. They're striving to maximize this for pleasure from which they both benefit. Maximizing pleasure is not a zero-sum game, but they cooperate to do this, but they're also, in some measure, in conflict to the extent that they disagree about the truth, about values. So what the model shows is that if its constraints are specified just so, and it's our prerogative to stipulate that they are, then it turns out that the best strategy for speakers to maximize their personal value is to treat all differences between them as signaling a mistake for one or other speaker. that is, to reject the first possibility just mentioned, and the fourth. The required assumptions are that enough speakers opt into this strategy, and that the assumptions already made, that speakers mostly coincide in their appraisal of value, and appraisals of value are at least partly malleable, those two assumptions hold. If all this is the case, again, then you maximize value by taking it to be the case that everyone has the same, everyone's truth set is the same. To see this, suppose that a speaker disagrees with the majority about some token sentence taken to be true. He then gives up the pleasure, potentially, of all sentences whose support depends on that sentence, that token sentence, and which may be considerable in number. If he disagrees with the majority about even a small fraction of all sentences, he loses not just the pleasure of the sentences supported by them, but also the confidence that theory of sentences offered by others will rest on foundations which he would value, and so, in many cases, the possibility of valuing sentences on the strength just of others' trustworthiness. Admittedly, this speaker will get some compensation for those sentences lost, or pleasure lost, in the form of dependent sentences he contrives himself on the basis of his privately valued sentences. But since even the most prolific of solitary sentence producers will fall far short of what his community collectively can contrive, however, and since he will be deprived of the prima facie error checking afforded by communal acceptance, he will, on balance, be considerably less well off in terms of the pleasure. The extra value to be gained by an individual by participating in a community of speakers in which effectively everyone commits to and contributes to the construction of a single shared edifice, if you like, of truths, the extra benefit will easily offset the cost of sacrificing the pleasure of any genuinely sort of idiolectic potential preferences, affinities. So again, there are two main strategies. Strategy one is for each speaker to go it alone in the quest for truth, trading sentences to be sure, but diverging wherever other speakers disagree and not taking there to be any benefit in finding consensus and conforming to it. Strategy two is for speakers to take there to be just one pleasure maximizing set of sentences and to understand themselves to get maximum benefit by joining a sort of common contract to contribute to this one set. And the interesting result here is that for simple pleasure maximization, strategy two turns out to be the better strategy in some circumstances which we can stipulate in fact hold. And of course, we have in the model, we have to verify that they hold in reality for this all to make the point it's meant to. In the model, this is, as it should be, just an implication of the definitions. Just as a speaker's value function determines for any given set of sentences a total value, all speakers' functions jointly determine combined aggregate value for the linguistic community, if you like. The suggested definition of objective truth, so not of truth for a speaker, as just above, is a token sentence S is true, period, not for speaker A, is true just in case S is an element of a set which would maximize the combined aggregate value of all speakers, and the removal of any of whose elements would result in a set of lower aggregate value. The objectivity of truth is naturally built into the implicit contract governing sentential exchange. In uttering a sentence, a speaker is communicating not merely here's one I find valuable, maybe you will too, but rather something like, if we all find the value in this one, we'll all be better off on balance. To be able to reap the substantial benefits of communal truth-acquiring efforts, a speaker who finds herself at odds with the balance of other speakers will, as I've said, be motivated to try to reconcile her and the prevailing beliefs. And evidently, this will often involve her reviewing her own hierarchy of beliefs for a failure which may have led to the difference. Sometimes, though, it will involve a vigorous campaign to try to bring the community round to seeing that what she believes is optimal for the shared hierarchy of sentences. So, widespread communal agreement about truth is an indicator of truth, but not a determinant. Truth, it will be noticed, is democratic. Everyone's value weighs equally. The claim from legal or ethical theory that we all are equal, not in talents or potential, but in expectation of consideration, is paralleled here. If, as I'm suggesting, the quest for truth properly is, like the quest for individual betterment in a social context, at once collaborative and competitive, then it's reasonable to expect that the implicit contract for participation should be comparable. This is to say, it's reasonable that speakers should expect their judgments about truth, their evaluations, if you like, in the idealized limit, if not in practice, to weigh equally to those of any other. So, to finish off then, a very quick summary. Truth has the following characteristics. First, it's a property of sentence tokens. This is amended later when propositions are introduced, but in first instance, sentence tokens are the bearers of truth. Secondly, it's objective, insofar as the truth value of sentence token is the same for all speakers. Thirdly, it's normative, in the sense that one ought to believe what is true, and only what is true, if one's goal is to maximize value, and getting value, and hence pleasure, as we stipulated, is the only motivation to bother with sentences. So that's the third point. Fourth point is that it is tracked by communal agreement, but transcends it. Complete communal consensus as to the truth value of a sentence is not a guarantee that the sentence maximizes value. There may be a community-wide mistake. So this last item is the gap requirement. Truth is related to what speakers value on one hand, but is also distinct from it, doesn't collapse into it. So there you have it. I've described a simple little world populated with people, sentence-like sounds, a valuing relation, and a special pleasure characteristic, and nothing else. What I'm calling the model or framework. I've imposed some constraints and stipulated a bunch of definitions based on the properties of the model, culminating in the definition of truth. All of this, hopefully, is innocent. What is not innocent, I'll acknowledge, but what I hope you found compelling, is my suggestion that the stipulated truth property of sentences characterizes natural language truth as it applies to sentences. Thanks for your interest.